Looking at the adversarial side of security, there are several terms that are often used and also sometimes confused. In this part, we will take a closer look at the terms threat, vulnerability, weakness, and attack. A threat in information security is defined as a hypothetical event that could happen, and it could be made worse by exploiting vulnerabilities. It does not mean that it will happen or that it is even likely that it will happen. But if it happens, it can create a loss of confidentiality, integrity, and/or availability, which are the three main goals that we discussed before. The threat can potentially cause harm to an information asset or a resource. This threat can be realized by a person, but it could also be an event. The person could be a disgruntled employee that is capable of harming the organization by, for example, stealing or destroying information, or give the organization a bad reputation. An event could be, for example, an earthquake, a pandemic, or a power outage. The probability of these threats being realized will differ between different organizations, both on type of organizations, its size, and its location. The threats could also be deliberate when someone actively tries to, for example, steal or destroy information, or they can be purely accidental, by someone making an honest mistake, either within or outside the organization. Or it can be an act of nature, for example, an earthquake or a flood. An example of a threat to software integrity could be that software is modified to do an unintended task. The modification here is the violation of the integrity goal of the software or the system. An example of a threat to data confidentiality is that communication is eavesdropped. Since eavesdropping leaks information, this threat is related to confidentiality. The next term we will discuss is vulnerability. A vulnerability is an issue or inherent weakness that can result in a successful attack. The vulnerability will allow or enable a threat to be realized, perhaps with higher probability or with a more devastating result. If ransomware is considered a threat, then related vulnerabilities would be, for example, specific bugs in the software that can be used to spread the ransomware in an organization. The impact when the vulnerability is exploited is then typically measured in terms of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. An example of a vulnerability is a program that contains a bug that allows an attacker to read information in the computer memory. Such a vulnerability will probably have a high confidentiality impact, but no integrity or availability impact. Another example could be that the server process does not free memory after it has been used, rendering the server very slow. That vulnerability would have a medium or high availability impact, but no impact on confidentiality or integrity. The exact scale used to determine the impact is dependent on the system used for quantifying severeness. The CVSS score, which is an industry standard for rating vulnerabilities, currently use none, low, and high for the three impact metrics. Together with other aspects of the vulnerability, the severeness forms a score between 0 and 10. Weaknesses are often not formally defined, but the common use of the term is to refer to a general error that could lead to a vulnerability, or that sometimes materializes as a vulnerability. While a vulnerability is something that can be exploited, a weakness might or might not be exploitable. The weakness can be present not only in the software implementation, but also in the design, in the configuration, or in the management of software or systems. To clarify the difference between weaknesses and vulnerabilities, as the terms are often used, consider the following examples. A weakness would be to copy data into a buffer without checking the size of the data so that it fits in the buffer. Doing this would always be considered a weakness, but if it is done in such a way that it can be exploited to compromise the system, then it is also a vulnerability. Another example of a weakness is improper neutralization of input to a web application. Such failure to neutralize or sanitize user-generated input might not be a real problem if the input is not used in an exploitable way. However, in certain cases, such input might be used to compute the response sent back to the server. Then this weakness will most likely also be a vulnerability, and in this case a so-called cross-site scripting vulnerability. A third example of a weakness is to have excessive code complexity. This is certainly not good, but does not immediately mean that there is something to exploit in order to compromise the system. Thus, it is a weakness but not a vulnerability. However, excessive code complexity can very well lead to vulnerabilities, or at least increase the probability of having vulnerabilities. Finally, we discuss the attack. An attack is a threat that is carried out. It sometimes takes advantage of a vulnerability in order to realize the attack or increase its success probability or impact. To clarify the relation to threats, attacks are sometimes also called threat actions, and the attacker is called the threat agent. Depending on the properties of the attack, it can be categorized in different ways. One dimension is how the attack affects the system. In a passive attack, the attacker tries to learn or use information from the system without affecting the system itself. While in an active attack, the attacker alters the system resources or affects their operation as part of the attack. It is often easier to detect active attacks since they leave some traces, while passive attacks like eavesdropping are more difficult to detect. However, passive attacks can still have very severe impact on the confidentiality, integrity, or availability to a system. Another dimension for categorization is the origin of the attack. An insider attack is an attack that is initiated by an entity within a defined security perimeter. People working at a company are usually within the security perimeter of that company, since employees have access to much information at the company. But one company can have several perimeters depending on what information to protect. We can say that you are within the perimeter if you have legitimate access to the information or privileges that allows you to easily access the information. If the attack is instead initiated from outside the security perimeter, it is an outsider attack. The outsiders do not have legitimate access to the system or the information. Instead, they typically need to rely on bypassing some authentication or authorization process in order to succeed with the attack. We end this overview by referencing some well-known methods and information sources related to these terms. There are several proposed methodologies for doing threat modeling. The most well-known is probably STRIDE. STRIDE is short for the 6 general threats: spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, and elevation of privilege. The model takes these threats as a starting point for modeling threats for a system. Another well-known model is PASTA, which is short for Process for Attack Simulation and Threat Analysis. PASTA focuses on the attacker's perspective with a goal to implement countermeasures to known vulnerabilities and weaknesses. For vulnerabilities, the Common Vulnerabilities and Exposures Numbering Scheme, abbreviated CVE, is the standard for reporting and uniquely identifying known vulnerabilities. It is an attempt to centralize information about vulnerabilities in both software and hardware. A similar enumeration exists for weaknesses. CWE is short for Common Weaknesses Enumeration and is an attempt to categorize different weaknesses with the goal of better understanding possible flaws in software. There are more than 600 categories of weaknesses, many of them with educational descriptions and examples. A similar listing, but from the attacker's perspective, is CAPEC, which is short for Common Attack Pattern Enumeration and Classification. It is a classification of known attack patterns used by adversaries. It is associated with the weaknesses enumerated by the CWE. A similar knowledge base is given by ATTACK, which is short for Adversarial Tactics, Techniques, and Common Knowledge. It describes the different phases an adversary goes through when attacking a system. Without going into details, CAPEC is more of the form for code injection, what are the prerequisites, the consequences, and the mitigations, while ATTACK is more of the form first the attacker gathers information in one of the following ways, then initial resources are developed, followed by an initial access, and so on. It enumerates the adversary's techniques and tactics for conducting the attack. It also includes different mitigations. All these resources are very useful when understanding, assessing, and protecting systems from an information security point of view. We can summarize these 4 terms by combining them as: a vulnerability is a weakness that, through an attack, can realize a threat that impacts the confidentiality, integrity, or availability of information assets. The last term that we're going to discuss is risk. This will be treated in the fifth and final part.